25% on the border can do what tanks can't, because a 25% tariff doesn't just raise prices, it rewires supply chains, crushes capital expenditure plans, and turns allies into hedgers. And right now, the United States is applying that kind of pressure to Canada and Mexico under emergency powers, using the language of war and invasion, while pretending the only casualties will be on the other side of the line. That's not how tariffs work. That's not how integrated economies work. And if you understand the mechanics, you'll see why this moment isn't just a trade dispute. It's the beginning of a continental renegotiation of power, one that will culminate at a single deadline most people aren't watching closely enough: the USMCA review in 2026. Stay with me, because later in this video, I'm going to show you the real objective hiding behind the theatrics. Not border security, not stopping fentanyl. The strategic objective is leverage, maximum leverage, before the USMCA clock forces everyone into the same room. And once you see that, you'll understand why this trade war language is being used like a weapon of domestic politics, while the real weapon is uncertainty itself. Welcome back to the Dollar Watch. We cover the hidden economy, the parts of policy that don't look dramatic until they hit your bills, your job, and your nation's long-term strategic position. If you want more briefings like this as the USMCA review approaches, subscribe now. The next 12 to 18 months are going to define North America's economic structure for a generation. Now let's strip away the noise and define what's actually happening. In early 2025, the Trump administration imposed broad tariffs on goods imported from Canada and Mexico. The numbers reported and widely discussed are severe, roughly 25% across most goods, with a lower 10% rate on certain Canadian energy products, an implicit admission that completely choking energy flows would create immediate political blowback inside the United States. The legal basis cited is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, a 1977 statute designed to give presidents wide authority to regulate commerce during declared national emergencies. IEEPA is not a normal tariff tool. That's what makes this so consequential. Under the Constitution, tariffs are taxes, and Congress holds the power to impose taxes. Over decades, Congress delegated chunks of trade authority to the executive branch, often for narrow purposes like national security, unfair trade practices, or true emergencies. But using IEEPA to impose sweeping tariffs against neighboring allies takes executive power into a gray zone that courts and historians will be debating for years. And that legal fragility matters because it creates a second layer of uncertainty. Not only what will tariffs be next month, but can these tariffs even survive? That's the first open loop I want you to keep in mind. If the legal basis is weak, this whole policy may be reversible overnight by a court ruling or a political pivot. But the economic damage isn't reversible on a dime, because once uncertainty infects supply chains, companies redesign their strategies. They don't go back just because a press release says tariffs lifted. Now, the administration's stated justifications have centered on illegal immigration, drug trafficking, and border security, framing trade with allies as an emergency. Whether you find that argument persuasive or not, the observable effect is not abstract. The tariffs are real. They function like a tax at the border, and they land inside the North American economy that was built, intentionally, around frictionless trade. To understand why this is so explosive, you need to understand what NAFTA and then USMCA actually did in the real world. NAFTA wasn't just a trade agreement. It was a blueprint for a continental factory. From the mid-1990s onward, businesses didn't merely export more, they reorganized production. They built supply chains that treated North America as one integrated platform. Parts cross borders multiple times before final assembly. Intermediate goods move constantly. Capital investment decisions were made under one core assumption: predictable cross-border flow. Then USMCA updated the rules, but it didn't change the fundamental architecture. If anything, it reinforced the idea that North America would remain integrated because the incentives were overwhelming. Proximity, logistics efficiency, shared standards, and a production ecosystem that had matured over 30 years. So when you slap a 25% tariff on that ecosystem, you're not punishing a foreign country. You're breaking the operating system of a continent-scale industrial machine. And the immediate consequences are not subtle. Prices rise because tariffs are paid by importers. That's not rhetoric, that's customs law. The importing firm pays the tariff to the US government. Then the importer either eats it in margins, rare, long-term, or passes it through to customers, or renegotiates terms with suppliers, or changes its sourcing. No matter which path it takes, the consumer and the real economy feel it. But the deeper consequence is even more important: uncertainty. Uncertainty kills investment. It delays factories. It freezes hiring. It makes firms hoard inventory. It forces risk departments to widen spreads and tighten credit. It makes CFOs stop thinking about growth and start thinking about survival. And when you do that to an integrated economic region, you don't create a clean win for one country. You create value destruction for everyone, distributed unevenly. Now let's talk about asymmetry, because this is where the US strategy is coming from, and where it can still backfire. Canada sends roughly 3/4 of its exports to the United States. Mexico sends an even larger share. Those are not just trade numbers, that's economic orientation. Entire sectors in both countries are built on access to the American market. So yes, the United States has leverage. It is the largest market in the relationship, and in any market relationship, the biggest buyer has power. That's the temptation. That's the reasoning. But leverage is not the same as invulnerability. In an integrated system, dependency runs both ways. The United States depends on Canadian energy inputs and specific commodities. It depends on Canadian intermediate goods. It depends on Mexican manufacturing throughput, especially in autos, electronics, appliances, and the entire nearshoring strategy that American firms spent years building. And Americans depend on the end results: affordable goods, stable supplies, and predictable prices. When you disrupt Canada and Mexico, you disrupt American supply. That's why tariffs are a self-tax. You can call it pressure. The IRS calls it revenue. Your grocery store calls it higher prices. Now, how did Canada respond? On the surface, the response looks predictable: retaliation. That's how trade disputes work. If you tax my goods, I tax yours. It's a signaling game, and it's also a political necessity for leaders who can't appear weak. But the asymmetry shows up quickly. Retaliatory tariffs can hurt specific American sectors. They can create pain in targeted states and industries, but they cannot threaten the American economy as a whole. Canada, on the other hand, faces something closer to a national economic crisis when access to the US market becomes unstable. That pressure spills into politics. In this timeline, Canada goes through leadership transition. Justin Trudeau resigns. Mark Carney rises. And the reason that matters is that Carney is not a normal political operator. He's a central banker by training and by temperament. He understands markets. He understands liquidity. He understands the difference between a rhetorical fight and a structural shift. So instead of making the dispute purely emotional, Carney's posture, based on what has been reported and how he speaks, leans towards something colder: reduce exposure, build alternatives, diversify. And this is where Washington may have miscalculated. Because if your strategy is to use dependence as a weapon, the rational response is to treat dependence as a vulnerability and eliminate it over time. That is exactly what diversification means. It is not retaliation. It is exit planning. You've already seen evidence of this in other sectors. Canada redirecting certain agricultural exports, exploring non-US buyers for key commodities, strengthening logistics pathways, and discussing new trade and security arrangements elsewhere. Those moves don't replace the US market overnight. Nothing replaces the US market overnight. But that's not the point. The point is marginal change. And marginal change is how empires lose leverage. Not with one dramatic pivot, but with a slow reduction of dependence until the threat loses its bite. Now, Mexico's situation is similar in economic structure, but different in political pressure. Mexico's manufacturing base, especially the maquiladora system, was built around U.S. supply chains. It's not just exports, it's co-production. Components and subassemblies move north as part of American manufacturing. So tariffs don't just punish Mexico, they raise costs for American producers and slow throughput. But Mexico also faces a second narrative layer: security framing. The administration has tied trade pressure to narcotics and immigration issues, and reports suggest rhetoric about taking action against cartel organizations. That kind of language creates a uniquely toxic strategic ambiguity, because targeting cartels sounds like law enforcement, but when a foreign leader discusses unilateral action inside another sovereign state, you are on the edge of a sovereignty crisis. And Mexican leaders live inside a political reality where public acceptance of foreign intervention is not just unpopular, it's destabilizing. It can ignite nationalist backlash. It can threaten the legitimacy of the state itself. So Mexico is forced into a balancing act: reject intervention publicly while seeking accommodation privately, while trying to preserve the economic bloodstream that runs north through the border. And there are reports of Mexico making certain policy adjustments to address U.S. concerns about transshipment, Chinese components moving through Mexico into U.S. markets. That's a fascinating dynamic because it reveals the logic of alignment under pressure. Mexico tries to keep access to the U.S. by aligning with certain U.S. industrial security preferences, even while resisting the framing that Mexico is a security problem to be punished. Now, here's the open loop that ties all of this together. Why now? Why did this escalation happen in 2025? Because the USMCA has a built-in review mechanism in 2026. The agreement contains a kind of sunset and review architecture that forces the parties into formal reassessment. If the parties do not agree to extend, the framework can enter a period of rolling uncertainty, leading toward termination later. Whether or not that full termination happens, the review is a deadline, and deadlines create bargaining windows. From a negotiating perspective, the logic is brutally simple. You apply maximum pressure before the review, so that when the review arrives, you negotiate from strength. You make it clear that access is conditional. You demonstrate willingness to inflict pain. You create fear in boardrooms and ministries that the status quo will not persist unless concessions are made. This is classic leverage strategy, applied at continental scale. The question is whether the concessions gained will outweigh the value destroyed in the process. Because yes, tariffs can force attention, but they also force adaptation, and adaptation is what kills long-term leverage. Now let's talk about the part that mainstream coverage consistently avoids because it's not exciting: how tariffs actually transmit through an economy. When a Canadian good is hit with a 25% tariff, the Canadian producer does not usually write a 25% check to the U.S. Treasury. The American importer does. The importer then decides how to manage the cost. If the good is essential and cannot be substituted easily, the importer passes it on. If the importer tries to squeeze the supplier may accept a discount temporarily, but suppliers also adapt. They find new buyers. They renegotiate, they shift capacity, they raise prices elsewhere. In the short term, tariffs act like a tax on domestic consumption. They collect revenue for the government, and they reduce real purchasing power for households. That is why multiple analysts across the ideological spectrum often agree on the basic point: tariffs are inflationary pressure. But the second-order effects can be worse than the first-order effects. Second-order effects include inventory hoarding, delays, border friction, compliance costs, and capital expenditure freezes. When businesses don't know whether the tariff rate next quarter will be 0%, 25%, or 35%, they can't plan. And when planning collapses, growth collapses. This is where the war language becomes dangerously misleading. War implies a clear enemy and a clear objective. Trade war in an integrated system is more like detonating explosives in your own factory to prove you're willing to suffer. The other side suffers too, but the factory is still damaged. Now I want to show you the strategic irony that most American viewers will miss unless it's stated plainly. The United States is leveraging its market size to extract concessions. But by doing so, it is teaching Canada and Mexico that reliance on the United States is a national vulnerability. That lesson doesn't expire when the tariffs do. So even if the 2026 USMCA review results in concessions that look like a win on paper, changes to rules of origin, market access provisions, enforcement mechanisms, the long-term cost may be that Canada and Mexico invest aggressively in diversification. Canada builds deeper trade and logistics ties with Europe and Asia. Mexico builds deeper manufacturing ties with other markets and strengthens its own domestic supply chain resilience. Both countries work to reduce their exposure to American political volatility. The U.S. can still be their biggest market, but it becomes less dominant, and less dominance means less leverage. This is what soft de-integration looks like. It doesn't require a dramatic breakup. It requires enough uncertainty to push long-term planning elsewhere. Now, you might ask, but can Canada and Mexico really diversify away from the U.S.? Not completely, not quickly. Geography is destiny. Proximity matters. Existing infrastructure matters. But diversification doesn't have to be total to matter. If a country shifts 10% of its trade exposure away over time, that can materially reduce the coercive power of tariffs. If it shifts 20%, even more. And those shifts can happen through marginal contracts, marginal investments, and marginal policy decisions that accumulate. That is how a partner slowly becomes harder to bully. Now let's bring this down to the street level, because this is where the dollar watch audience cares most. What does this mean for you? It means prices rise in categories tied to cross-border inputs, vehicles, appliances, construction materials, food products, energy in certain regions. It means layoffs are more likely in sectors dependent on smooth cross-border production. It means small businesses that rely on stable input prices face margin compression. It also means markets become more volatile, because markets hate uncertainty. A continent-scale tariff regime is a volatility machine. It changes earnings expectations. It changes inflation assumptions. It changes the path of interest rates. It changes currency flows. It creates systematic risk because it pushes firms toward defensive behavior, hoarding cash, reducing investment, and tightening credit. And here's another open loop. When credit tightens, the entire economy slows in ways people don't attribute to tariffs. They blame greedy companies. They blame the Fed. They blame immigrants. But the root cause is often the collapse of planning. And planning collapses when rules become political weapons. Now, we need to address the elephant in the room. Is this strategy working? It depends on what you mean by working. If the objective is to force Canada and Mexico to the table under pressure before the USMCA review, it's working. Pressure creates urgency. Uncertainty creates fear. Fear creates concession incentives. If the objective is to improve American household welfare, it is not working, because tariffs function as a domestic tax and supply chain friction raises costs. If the objective is to strengthen North American competitiveness against China, it is likely not working, because the continent's competitive advantage was integration. Integration made North America efficient. Efficiency lowers costs. Lower costs increase competitiveness. Breaking integration to prove toughness reduces competitiveness while China continues executing its long-term industrial strategy. And if the objective is long-term leverage, it may be self-defeating because coercion incentivizes diversification, and diversification dissolves dependence. That's the paradox. The harder you squeeze, the more the other side learns to build an escape hatch. Now, I'm going to say something that will upset partisans on both sides, and that's fine. Truth doesn't exist to protect anyone's feelings. Trade is not a morality play. It's a system. In a system, actions have second and third order consequences, and in integrated systems, damage spreads. It doesn't stay neatly on their side. This is why the war language is so toxic. It turns complex economic integration into a cartoon. It makes people cheer policies that quietly raise their own cost structure. It makes voters equate pain with strength. That's how you end up with policy decisions that feel satisfying and perform terribly. Now, what happens next? We have a calendar, and the calendar is the real power here. As we move toward the 2026 USMCA review, pressure will rise. The United States will likely continue using market access as a bargaining chip. Canada and Mexico will continue seeking ways to reduce vulnerability. Businesses across all three countries will continue redesigning supply chains to survive policy volatility. The outcome could be one of three broad scenarios. 1. A negotiated extension with modifications that restore some stability. This would likely require face-saving language and a re-legitimization of the rules. It could calm markets, but the memory of coercion would remain, and diversification would not fully reverse. 2. Prolonged uncertainty, annual reviews, recurring tariff threats, a permanent politics at the border environment. This is the slow poison scenario. It doesn't collapse the system overnight. It gradually degrades it. 3. Deintegration accelerates. Not necessarily a formal USMCA termination immediately, but a rerouting of investment away from North American cross-border dependence. Companies choose redundancy and security over efficiency. That raises costs permanently. That's how the continent becomes structurally more expensive. Now, here's the final point I want you to take seriously, because it's the most important and the least discussed. North America's greatest economic advantage wasn't cheap labor or tariffs or slogans. It was the integration itself. The ability to build, move, and sell across a massive, resource-rich region with complementary strengths: Canadian energy and minerals, American capital markets and technology, Mexican manufacturing throughput and demographics under predictable rules. When you turn that advantage into a coercion tool, you risk destroying the asset to extract short-term concessions. That is not strategy. That is liquidation. And liquidation is a term from finance for a reason. It's what happens when you sell the future to pay for the present. So if you want to stay ahead of this, don't watch the speeches. Watch the signals. Watch corporate capex decisions. Watch supply chain relocation announcements. Watch trade flow rerouting. Watch currency settlement changes. Watch what Canada and Mexico sign with third parties while Washington is focused on pressure tactics. And above all, watch July 2026. That's the hinge. Drop a comment with your prediction. Does USMCA get extended cleanly, renegotiated under pressure, or dragged into rolling uncertainty? And tell me where you're seeing price increases already. Autos, groceries, building materials, energy. I read the comments because in macro, local reality often appears before the national data. This isn't a war, it's a leverage campaign, and leverage campaigns have a habit of backfiring when the target starts building alternatives. North America is learning in real time that you can weaponize trade, but you cannot weaponize it without paying a price yourself.